The Harmattan winds whispered ancient secrets across the Lagos tarmac as Apostle Johnson Suleman adjusted his white agbada, the pristine fabric catching the amber glow of the setting sun. His weathered hands, adorned with simple gold rings that spoke of covenant rather than wealth, gripped his worn leather Bible, the same one his grandmother had pressed into his palms when he was but a boy in Auchi, dreaming of forests and spirits that danced between the Irako trees. "Omo me," she had whispered in broken English mixed with Itsako, "the ancestors walk with those who carry truth. Never forget where your feet first touched the earth." Now, 47 years later, standing before the gleaming Boeing 737 that would carry him to London for what newspapers called another prosperity gospel crusade, Johnson felt the weight of those words settle upon his shoulders like his mother's worn wrapper on a cold Harmattan morning. The aircraft loomed before him, a silver bird that belonged to the new world, the world of glass towers and digital prophets, the world that had forgotten the sound of talking drums and the wisdom carried in palm wine libations. Yet here he was, a son of red earth and ancient covenants, about to step into its belly. "Apostle." The voice cut through his reverie like a machete through thick bush. His assistant, Emeka, appeared at his side, sweating through his expensive suit, clutching boarding passes and documents like sacred scrolls. "Sir, your seat is ready?" "First class, as requested by the London Committee." Johnson nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the plane. Something stirred in his spirit, that familiar quickening he'd learned to recognize after decades of walking between worlds. The same sensation he'd felt as a young pastor in the remote villages of Edo State, when witch doctors would challenge him to spiritual duels under the full moon, and he'd emerge victorious not through showmanship, but through a power that flowed from deeper wells than human understanding. "Emeka," he said quietly, his voice carrying the rhythmic cadence that made thousands weep in his crusades, "tell me something. When was the last time you visited your village?" The younger man shifted uncomfortably. "Apostle, it's been years. You know how it is with progress and all." "Progress." Johnson tasted the word like bitter cola. "Yes, we all know about progress." The boarding queue moved with the mechanical efficiency of modern travel. Businessmen in tailored suits scrolled through phones, their eyes reflecting the cold light of screens rather than the warm flame of human connection. Foreign executives clutched briefcases filled with contracts that would strip more resources from African soil, leaving behind holes that no amount of promised development could fill. As Johnson approached the aircraft steps, he felt the ancestors stirring, not with approval, but with a warning that prickled his skin like the approach of a sudden rainstorm. The cabin air hit him immediately, recycled, sterile, devoid of the life force that pulsed through African air thick with palm oil, wood smoke and the dreams of millions. Flight attendants smiled with professional courtesy, their trained pleasantness as artificial as the flowers in hotel lobbies. "Welcome aboard, sir. Your seat is 2A, chirped a young woman whose accent had been carefully trained to strip away any trace of her origins. Johnson studied her face for a moment, high cheekbones that spoke of Yoruba heritage, skin the color of shea butter, eyes that had probably once danced to dun-dun drums before corporate training taught her to see passengers as revenue units rather than souls carrying stories. "Thank you, my daughter," he replied in English deliberately flavored with the warm tones of his homeland. "What is your name?" She hesitated, glancing around nervously. My professional name is Sarah, sir." "And your real name?" "The one your grandmother whispered when you first cried in this world." Her mask slipped for just a moment. "Adunni," she whispered as if speaking a secret prayer. "Beautiful. Adunni, one who is sweet to have. Your grandmother chose well." Johnson moved toward his seat, noting how the simple exchange had brought tears to her eyes. This was the tragedy of the new Africa, children taught to be ashamed of names that carried power, convinced that progress meant severing the roots that had sustained their people through centuries of trial. First class stretched before him like a cocoon of privilege, leather seats wide as thrones, passengers cocooned in individual pods of luxury. He recognized the type immediately, oil executives who'd spent decades extracting wealth from Niger Delta communities while leaving behind environmental devastation, politicians who'd grown fat on foreign aid meant for their people, expatriate Africans who now spoke of their homeland with embarrassed disdain. His assigned seat placed him beside a white man in an expensive suit who radiated the particular arrogance Johnson had encountered countless times. The confidence of someone who'd never questioned his right to spaces, to respect, to being heard. As Johnson settled into his seat, organizing his reading materials with the careful reverence of one who understood the power of words, he became aware of pointed stares and whispered conversations. "Look at that one," came a voice from across the aisle, British accent polished by years of colonial superiority. Another one of those prosperity preachers. Probably flying on money stolen from poor Africans. Disgusting really, replied his companion, a woman whose jewelry cost more than most African families earned in a year. They prey on desperation. No different from the witch doctors if you ask me. Johnson's hands stilled on his Bible. The familiar fire began to build in his chest, not anger but something deeper. The righteous indignation that had driven him to establish schools in remote villages, to drill boreholes in communities forgotten by the government, to stand as a shield between his people and forces that would devour them. The man beside him, clearly emboldened by the whispered support, turned with a smirk that belonged in colonial museums. I say, Reverend, he began, his voice dripping with condescension, quite the upgrade from the bush, isn't it? Though I suppose fleecing the faithful pays well these days. The cabin fell silent. Even the hum of engines seemed to quiet, as if the aircraft itself held its breath. Johnson felt the ancestral stirring again, stronger now, like drums calling warriors to battle. He turned slowly, fixing the man with eyes that had seen miracles and tragedies, that had watched spirits bow and demons flee. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of ancient kings and the wisdom of village elders. Brother, he began, the word itself a gentle rebuke, you speak of the bush as if it birthed nothing but darkness. Tell me, what do you know of the bush? The man laughed, but uncertainty flickered behind his eyes. Primitive superstition, backwardness. Everything civilization has worked to overcome. Ah. Johnson nodded thoughtfully. So you believe civilization began when your people decided our ways were worthless? Around them, other passengers leaned forward. The African flight attendants paused in their duties, recognizing something primal unfolding, the kind of confrontation their grandmothers would have called a testing of spirits. Now see here, the man began, but Johnson raised a gentle hand. Peace, brother. Let me tell you about the bush. The bush where my grandmother could predict weather patterns more accurately than your satellites. Where traditional healers understood psychological trauma and treated it with ceremonies your psychiatrists are only now beginning to comprehend. Where communities resolved conflicts through restorative justice while your courts created more criminals than they reformed. His voice began to take on the rhythmic quality that had moved multitudes, not shouting but speaking with the measured cadence of oral tradition, each word carrying weight like stones cast into still water. You see this Bible? He held up the worn leather volume. Given to me by a woman who could neither read nor write, but who carried more wisdom in her little finger than most university professors hold in their degrees. She knew every star by name, could tell you which plants would heal and which would harm, understood the delicate balance between the seen and unseen worlds. The British man's companion shifted uncomfortably. Well, yes, but surely you must admit that modern medicine, technology, education have brought great gifts, Johnson agreed. I am not against progress, my sister. I am against the lie that progress requires us to despise our origins. He stood slowly, his full height imposing in the confined cabin space. The white igbata flowed around him like royal robes, and passengers found themselves remembering that this was not some roadside charlatan, but a man who commanded respect from presidents and paupers alike. You want to know what I did with the money you assume I stole from desperate people? The silence stretched taut as drum skin. Last month I buried a child. 7 years old. Beautiful girl named Blessing, from a village your oil companies had poisoned. No clean water for 50 kilometers. Government hospitals had no equipment, no medicine. Private hospitals demanded payment up front, payment her family would never possess. His voice never rose, but power emanated from him like heat from glowing coals. The prosperity you mock? It built the medical facility that tried to save her. The donations from desperate Africans funded the helicopter that flew in specialists from 3 countries. The tithes from poor farmers bought equipment that your insurance companies call too expensive for African lives. Adunni, the flight attendant, stood frozen in the aisle, tears streaming down her face. Other African passengers, the ones who'd tried to make themselves invisible in this space of assumed superiority, began to straighten in their seats. We lost Blessing anyway, Johnson continued, and now the cabin felt like a cathedral, his words echoing with prophetic authority. But her death was not in vain if it teaches us that dignity cannot be purchased with the approval of those who would diminish us. The British man had gone pale, his earlier smugness evaporating like morning mist. You speak of the bush as primitive, but let me ask you, when was the last time you slept without pills? When was the last time you gathered with neighbors to solve problems together? When was the last time you felt connected to something larger than your bank account? Johnson began to move through the cabin, and passengers instinctively leaned toward him, drawn by something their rational minds couldn't explain but their spirits recognized. In the bush you mock, children are raised by entire communities. Elders are revered, not abandoned in lonely institutions. Mental illness is treated as a spiritual crisis, not a chemical imbalance to be managed with medications that create more problems than they solve. His voice took on the sing-song quality of praise poetry, the rhythmic cadence that connected him to griots and storytellers stretching back through millennia. In the bush, we know that wealth means nothing if it comes at the cost of your soul. That progress is worthless if it severs you from the wisdom of your ancestors. That civilization is a lie if it teaches you to despise the very ground that gave you life. A young African man in an expensive suit, obviously one of the expatriates returning from studies abroad, suddenly began to weep. "Apostle," he whispered, I changed my name. Told my professors it was too difficult to pronounce. I was ashamed." Johnson stopped beside him, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder. "What name did your parents give you, son?" "Chukwemeka," the young man sobbed. "God has done so much. But I told them to call me Charles." "And what has God done for you, Chukwemeka?" He brought me from a village with no electricity to Oxford University. He turned a carpenter's son into an engineer." The young man's voice broke. "He gave me everything, but I threw away my own name." "Then take it back," Johnson said simply. "Names have power. Your ancestors understood this. When you deny your name, you deny the prayers spoken over you at birth, the dreams your parents held, the identity God shaped before you drew breath." Around the cabin, something extraordinary was happening. African passengers who had learned to make themselves small in such spaces began to sit straighter. The domestic workers in economy class, the ones traveling to serve in foreign homes, craned their necks to hear every word. Even the non-African passengers found themselves captivated by the raw authenticity flowing from this man who refused to be diminished. "You want to know what shocked you?" Johnson addressed the British man, who now seemed to have shrunk into his expensive suit. "It wasn't that I fought back against your disrespect. It was that I didn't apologize for existing. That I didn't scramble to prove myself worthy of sharing this space with you." He returned to his seat, but the dynamic in the cabin had fundamentally shifted. The man beside him no longer radiated superiority. Instead, he seemed diminished, uncertain, forced to confront assumptions he'd never questioned. "I will tell you something about respect," Johnson continued, settling back into his seat with the regal bearing of one comfortable in his own skin. "Respect is not earned by mimicking those who despise you. It is not won by abandoning your culture to embrace theirs. It is not purchased by speaking their language while forgetting your own." Adunni approached hesitantly, her professional mask completely gone. "Apostle," she whispered, my grandmother used to say that our names connect us to our destiny. I haven't used mine in 5 years." "Then you have been disconnected from your destiny for 5 years," Johnson replied gently. "But destiny is patient. It waits for us to remember who we are." The British man finally found his voice, though it lacked its earlier confidence. I meant no offense. I was merely—" "You were merely repeating what you were taught," Johnson interrupted, but without malice. "That African is inferior. That tradition equals backward. That spiritual equals superstition. These are the lies colonialism told to justify its theft, and they became so embedded in the world's thinking that even we began to believe them." He opened his Bible to a marked passage, the pages soft with years of handling. "But truth has a way of surfacing like oil from deep wells. The same continent you mock for its primitiveness gave the world mathematics, medicine, philosophy, art. The same traditions you dismiss as backward, sustained complex civilizations while your ancestors were painting themselves blue and living in caves." The cabin had become a sacred space, passengers hanging on every word. Flight attendants stood still in the aisles, their service duties forgotten in the face of something far more important. "The shock is not that an African man refuses to be diminished on an airplane," Johnson continued, his voice carrying the authority of one who had faced down witches and converted warlords. "The shock is that it took so long for us to remember our own power." A well-dressed African woman from business class suddenly stood up. "Apostle, may I ask for prayer? I've been living in London for 15 years and I don't even speak my mother tongue to my children anymore. I told myself it was for their future, but you severed them from their roots," Johnson finished gently. "Come here, daughter." She made her way forward, tears flowing freely. Johnson stood and placed his hands on her head in the ancient gesture of blessing. "Father of all nations," he began, his voice taking on the powerful resonance that had shaken auditoriums. "This daughter has forgotten her song. Restore to her the melodies her grandmother sang. Return to her children the language that carries the prayers of their ancestors. Let them not be strangers in foreign lands, but ambassadors of the wisdom you planted in African soil. Amen." The word erupted from multiple throats as passengers who had learned to worship quietly in Western spaces suddenly remembered the African way of praise, loud, joyous, unashamed. The British man looked around in bewilderment as the cabin transformed into something between a church and a traditional gathering. African passengers were standing, calling out agreements, some beginning to sway as ancestral rhythms stirred in their blood. "This is what you tried to kill with your civilization," Johnson addressed him directly. "This connection, this community, this understanding that we are not isolated individuals but part of something larger and older and more beautiful than your profit margins can measure." A young man from economy class, clearly a laborer by his calloused hands and worn clothes, raised his voice. "Apostle, tell them about the bush. Tell them about our wisdom." Johnson smiled, and it was like sunrise over the savannah. "Ah, my brother wants me to preach. Very well." He stood again, and this time his presence filled the entire cabin. The British passengers found themselves leaning forward despite themselves, caught in the gravitational pull of authentic power. "Let me tell you about African wisdom, since you are so eager to dismiss it. In my village, when there is conflict, we don't send people to prison to become worse criminals. We gather the community. We hear all sides. We find the root of the problem, usually some wound or injustice that has been festering. We heal the wound, restore the relationships, and make the community stronger." His voice began to take on the rhythmic quality of traditional storytelling, each word measured and weighted with meaning. "Your courts create enemies. Our councils create families. Your psychiatrists treat symptoms. Our healers address spiritual causes. Your schools teach information. Our elders impart wisdom. But surely," the British woman began. "Surely what?" Johnson's eyes flashed. "Surely your way is better because it's more advanced? Sister, let me ask you something. In all your advancement, are your people happier? Are they more connected? Do they sleep peacefully? Do they die surrounded by love?" The cabin fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of people confronting uncomfortable truths. "We have the highest rates of depression in human history. The most anxiety. The most suicide. The most loneliness. Children who don't speak to their parents. Elders dying alone in institutions. Communities where neighbors don't know each other's names." Johnson began to pace the narrow aisle, his agbada flowing like royal robes. "This is your civilization. This is your progress. And you mock the bush where children still play together instead of staring at screens? Where families still gather to share meals and stories? Where the elderly are treasures, not burdens." Chukwemeka, who had reclaimed his name, stood up again. "Apostle, how do we find our way back? How do we remember?" "Ah, now you ask the right question." Johnson's voice softened, taking on the gentle tone of a grandfather teaching children. "You remember by refusing to be ashamed. You remember by teaching your children the songs you learned at your mother's breast. You remember by calling things by their proper names." He gestured toward the window where African soil was now visible far below. "That is not just developing country down there. That is the cradle of humanity. The birthplace of civilizations that built pyramids when other continents were frozen wastelands. The home of kingdoms that traded with China and India when Europe was a collection of warring tribes." The African passengers began to murmur agreement, some beginning to remember pride they had been taught to forget. "You remember by refusing to accept the narrative that makes you grateful for scraps from tables your ancestors once owned. You remember by understanding that the oil they pump from your land, the gold they mine from your mountains, the diamonds they dig from your earth, these were gifts meant for your prosperity, not their profit." The British man was now visibly uncomfortable, but Johnson wasn't finished. "Most importantly, you remember by recognizing the spiritual battle behind the physical colonization. They didn't just want your resources, they wanted your soul. They wanted you to forget that you are children of the Most High, created with purpose and power. They wanted you to see yourselves through their eyes instead of God's eyes." Johnson's voice rose now, taking on the prophetic authority that had made demons tremble and dead things come to life. "But I prophesy to you today, the time of remembering has come. The season of awakening is here. Your children will not be ashamed of their heritage. Your grandchildren will speak the languages you almost lost. The wisdom your ancestors carried will flow through new generations like rivers breaking through dams. Yes, shouted the woman he had prayed for. Let it be so. The bush you mocked will teach your cities how to live in harmony. The traditions you called primitive will heal the wounds your modernity created. The spirituality you dismissed as superstition will restore the connection your technology severed. The cabin was now filled with the sound of African praise, clapping hands, shouted agreements, voices raised in languages that predated colonial borders. The non-African passengers sat in stunned silence, witnessing something they had never seen, Africans completely unashamed of being African. A dunny stepped forward, her uniform somehow transformed into garments of dignity by the straightness of her shoulders and the pride in her eyes. My name is a dunny, she announced to the entire cabin. It means sweetness to have, and I am proud to carry it. I will no longer hide who I am to make others comfortable. Applause erupted from the African passengers, and Johnson beamed like a proud father. This is what they feared, he said, his voice now gentle but carrying to every corner of the cabin. Not our anger, our joy. Not our hatred, our love for ourselves. Not our violence, our complete refusal to be diminished. The British man finally spoke, his voice small and uncertain. I don't understand. If you hate us so much, why don't you just hate you? Johnson turned to him with surprise. Brother, I don't hate you. I pity you. The words hung in the air like incense. I pity anyone who must diminish others to feel significant. I pity anyone who has never experienced the joy of being completely comfortable in their own skin. I pity anyone who mistakes dominance for strength, control for power. Johnson sat down beside him, and his proximity radiated not threat but genuine compassion. You carry the wounds of your ancestors too, brother? The wounds of people who were taught that conquest equals worth, that having more makes you more, that being feared is better than being loved. These are prison cells disguised as privileges. The man's eyes filled with tears he didn't understand. Your people are dying of loneliness in the midst of abundance. Medicating depression with chemicals instead of community. Building walls instead of bridges. This is not victory, this is tragedy. Johnson's voice took on the healing quality that had drawn millions to his crusades. The same God who made me African made you European. The same Creator who gave us Ubuntu gave you? Well, you'll have to rediscover what he gave you because conquest and exploitation certainly weren't his gifts. Gentle laughter rippled through the cabin, not mocking but somehow healing. The truth is we need each other. Not in the old way where you take and we give. But in God's way, where each brings their gifts to build something beautiful together. The British woman leaned forward. What gifts do you think we bring? Johnson smiled. Innovation without wisdom is destruction. But innovation with wisdom? That could heal the world. You have organizational abilities, technological insights, systematic thinking. We have spiritual wisdom, community understanding, harmony with creation. Imagine, he continued, his voice taking on the dreaming quality of prophets and visionaries, imagine African wisdom guiding European innovation. Imagine Ubuntu principles applied to global economics. Imagine traditional healing methods combined with modern medicine. Imagine. He stood again, his vision expanding to fill the cabin. Imagine a world where progress doesn't require anyone to forget who they are. Where development means the flowering of human potential, not the destruction of human diversity. Where strength is measured by how well you lift others, not how effectively you push them down. The plane was beginning its descent toward London, but no one seemed to notice. The cabin had become a sacred space where walls between peoples were dissolving like salt in water. This is what I do that shocks them, Johnson said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute truth. I refuse to be small so they can feel big. I refuse to be poor so they can feel rich. I refuse to be ashamed so they can feel superior. He looked directly at the British man, who met his gaze for the first time with something approaching respect. Most shocking of all, I love them anyway. Because love that transforms is more powerful than hate that destroys. Because reconciliation that heals is more valuable than revenge that wounds. Because the kingdom of God requires us to be bigger than their boxes, wider than their categories, deeper than their understanding. The descent continued, London's lights beginning to twinkle below like earthbound stars. But something profound had shifted in that pressurized metal tube suspended between earth and sky. Chukwuemeka stood up one more time. Apostle, when we land, when we go back to our lives, how do we hold on to this? How do we stay awake? Johnson smiled, and his answer carried the accumulated wisdom of ages. You hold on to it by remembering that this conversation happened 30,000 feet above the earth, but the truth we've spoken reaches all the way to heaven and all the way down to the roots of the baobab tree. You hold on to it by understanding that every time you refuse to be diminished, you create space for another person to stand tall. Every time you speak your truth with love, you give someone else permission to find their voice. You hold on to it by teaching your children that they are not accidents of geography, but strategic placements of divine purpose. That their skin color is not a burden to overcome, but an identity to celebrate. That their culture is not something to escape, but something to elevate. The plane touched down with the gentlest bump, but the passengers barely noticed. They were still suspended in the sacred space Johnson's words had created. As they began to gather their belongings, the British man turned to Johnson one final time. I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you gratitude. I didn't know how empty I was until I heard you speak about being full. Johnson clasped his hand, not in the perfunctory way of business transactions, but in the warm grip of human recognition. Brother, you owe me nothing. But you owe yourself everything. Find out who you are beyond the roles you've been taught to play. Discover what gifts the Creator planted in your spirit. Learn to love without conquering, to serve without controlling, to prosper without impoverishing others. As passengers began to disembark, something beautiful happened. A dunny moved through the cabin, and instead of the mechanical, "Thank you for flying with us," she looked each passenger in the eye and said, "May you carry the light of this moment into whatever darkness you face. May you remember that we are all children of the same God, branches of the same tree, waves in the same ocean." The African passengers moved with new dignity, shoulders straight, voices stronger. They gathered around Johnson as if reluctant to let the moment end. "Remember," he told them, "this plane was just a vehicle. But you are all vehicles too, carrying the dreams of your ancestors, the hopes of your children, the purposes of God. Don't crash on the runway of other people's expectations." One by one they filed off the plane, but they were not the same people who had boarded in Lagos. They carried themselves differently, spoke differently, saw themselves through different eyes. The British couple were among the last to leave. As they passed Johnson, the woman whispered, "Thank you for not hating us." "Sister," Johnson replied gently, "hate is too heavy to carry at this altitude. Love is the only thing light enough to fly." Finally, only Johnson and Emeka remained in the cabin. The younger man looked at his mentor with something approaching awe. "Apostle, I have heard you preach to thousands, seen miracles that defied explanation, watched you move in power that shook nations. But what happened here was the greatest miracle of all," Johnson finished. "The miracle of people remembering who they are. The miracle of dignity restored. The miracle of love defeating fear without throwing a single punch." As they walked through Heathrow Airport, something unprecedented happened. The African passengers from their flight had not dispersed to their various destinations. Instead, they had gathered in the terminal, still talking, still connecting, still holding on to the sacred space that had been created above the clouds. A dunny appeared at Johnson's side, no longer in her airline uniform but dressed in vibrant African prints that transformed her from service worker to queen. "Apostle," she said, "we've been talking. All of us. And we've decided something." "What's that, daughter?" "We're not going to go back to being small. We're not going to scatter and forget. We're going to stay connected. We're going to remember. We're going to live like children of kings because that's what we are." Johnson felt the ancestral spirits stirring again, but this time with approval, with joy, with the deep satisfaction of seeds finally taking root in good soil. "And that," he said to Emeka as they watched the group exchange contact information, making plans, building community, "is how you change the world. Not from platforms or pulpits but from the inside out. One person remembering their worth at a time." The story would be told and retold in African communities across London and beyond. Not the version the newspapers would print, about a controversial preacher causing a disturbance on a flight. But the real story, the true story, the story that would be whispered in homes and shared in churches and passed down to children who would grow up a little straighter, a little prouder, a little more certain of their place in God's great design. Years later, when people asked Apostle Johnson Suleman about the most powerful miracle he had ever witnessed, he would smile and tell them about the day he boarded a plane as just another passenger and discovered that the greatest miracle of all is not making the lame walk or the blind see. It's making the dignified remember their dignity. It's making the royal remember their royalty. It's making the chosen remember they were chosen. And sometimes, if you listen carefully to the harmattan winds that blow across African skies, you can still hear the echo of that sacred conversation, still feel the ripples of that moment when heaven touched earth at 30,000 feet, and a cabin full of scattered people remembered they were family. Ubuntu, Johnson whispered as he stepped into the London night. I am because we are. We are because I am. And in the distance, like drums calling the ancestors home, he could swear he heard the sound of his grandmother laughing.